This is the third of our session this morning, and this is we're going to talk about two sectors. We're going to talk about the financial sector, and then to follow up with Leo, we're going to talk very poignantly about the labor market. We won't talk much about the housing market, but clearly finance, housing, and labor are the three areas that the President and Congress has concentrated on in terms of instituting an economic recovery. I want to point out in my role as moderator that Roosevelt had 4 planks to his economic recovery program. And so far we're seeing the Obama administration and Congress really focusing on just 2 planks. The 4 planks that Roosevelt, the 4 fronts that Roosevelt fought on were monetary policy and bank regulation. We're certainly seeing a lot of action by Bernanke and the Fed, quite bold action. We're seeing some questioning of the past regulation of banks, and Bill Black will talk about what needs to be done with some comparisons of Roosevelt, but yet the monetary sector, the banking sector, is being paid attention to. The second place that Roosevelt departed from the current ideologies and policies was to abandon the idea that budgets had to be balanced. So we saw fiscal stimulus, fiscal policy affected really for the first time. Certainly Obama and the Congress understands that you have to do some deficit spending to replace the private spending by consumers and businesses that isn't happening. We all have talked about all morning about that fiscal spending not being enough, but certainly the principle is there. We have, however, 50 states that have a balanced budget initiative, and that certainly is a drag on fiscal stimulus. But so far, those 2 planks are being attended to. There's 2 other areas that Roosevelt moved very fast and hard at doing and focusing on, and that had to do with his very powerful Secretary of Labor, Francis Perkins, was to actually attend to social insurance policies to protect workers and their families, and also to protect workers' rights. And those areas are not being attended to. Leo just talked about the initiative to actually help unions overcome the illegal activities of companies preventing their unionization, moving away from that act. So there's nothing like the National Labor Relations Act on the horizon. And we are only expanding to a slight extent the social insurance policies, the automatic stabilizing programs that were put into place in the Great Depression. We've had some expansion of the unemployment insurance program, but no expansion of old age pensions, and no expansion to speak of aid to poor or near poor families. And we certainly don't have any discussion of a new kind of social insurance pact, like a supplement to Social Security. The only thing the Obama administration has talked about is expanding 401ks and individual retirement accounts to the great delight of Wall Street, but not attending to the national crisis we have in retirement savings. And the 4th plank, of course, that Roosevelt attended to was using the government as the employer of last resort. In the Depression, when the WPA program was at its height, 25% of families got income from that program. Now, yes, it's, as Peter Temin pointed out, the war and the stimulus with World War II kind of covered up the effects, or kind of muted and confused the effects of those employer of last resort programs, but that number alone, 25% of families got some income from the WPA program, tells you how wide and deep those programs were. There is really nothing like that. Weatherizing homes in Maine is not equivalent to the kind of public wealth creation and the jobs programs, direct jobs programs this government had. So those are where I see the deficits in the Obama and Clinton plan, and I hope our speakers today, of which we have 4, will attend to with great detail. Our first speaker is my esteemed colleague, and I'm very honored to be on the faculty with Duncan Foley. I've been on the faculty for a year now. It's my great delight to work with him. We'll talk about stimulus and what that is attending to. Then we have Bill Black, who will talk very specifically about bank regulation. And my colleague, labor economist at Harvard, Richard Freeman, will talk about what we can do with jobs. And my other colleague, Bill Rogers from Rutgers will also talk about the labor market and the economic recovery. So Duncan will go first, then Bill, then Dick, and then Bill Rogers.
Then Bill and Dick. Okay.
Okay. Yeah.
Well, I'd like to thank Jeff and Teresa for getting this mid-course correction checkup underway. When they first had their meeting on the crisis last November, I had a tendency to tell them, I said, well, it's too soon. It's too soon because things are changing so fast. And now I feel like this is too soon too, but I realize that sooner or later you have to sit down and talk about these things. Okay, I'm supposed to talk a little bit about finance, and I'll try to keep well within some time limits because there are people who know a lot more behind me on the program. And I wanted to just make a couple of comments about the financial policy that we have launched ourselves on, and then talk a little bit about the things that Alan Sinai was talking about, that is what the macroeconomics of this situation, what we might say about the macroeconomics of this situation, very briefly. You know, in Lagos, Nigeria, they apparently have a system where they run gasoline pipes directly from refineries on the coast through some of the poorest slums in the whole world to holding stations and distribution points. And this leads to the phenomenon of people at night going and punching holes in those gasoline lines and gathering gasoline, which is a valuable commodity, directly out of the pipeline. And I'm reminded of that when we think about the current financial policy of the United States. After all, even if you're Goldman Sachs or other big banks, the old-fashioned way of making money was very you had to do something. I mean, you had to somehow borrow money. And maybe it was the carry trade. You borrowed money at almost no interest rate in Japan, and then you lent it someplace else, and you got some surplus out of it. But now it's much better to have a direct pipeline to the Treasury. Much, much better, from their point of view. Because you don't really have to do anything much more than just hold up a bucket and let the money come down on you. But that seems to be the settled policy of the administration, and I don't think it's going to change until there is a very considerable amount of political pressure, and I think that reflects the political economic fact that the Democratic Party in the United States is in fact largely the party of financial and real estate interests, and it's not any mistake. It's not any accident that is showing up in Democratic policymaking. Now, Alan Sinai and confirmed the type of green shoots kind of talk that Larry Summers seems to be very taken with now, and that we're reaching the bottom. Now, exactly what this evidence is that we're reaching the bottom is not too clear. I mean, it seemed like it was a decline in the job loss figures from 610,000 to 540,000, which is a well, I suppose that's some kind of sign of improvement. On the other hand, I would say two things from just general macroeconomic theory. One is that capitalist economies that go through these kind of crises just don't go into a totally implosive tailspin. They do stabilize. I mean, even the U.S. economy did stabilize in the 1930s. It stabilized about 30% at a fall of real GDP of about 30% or more, but it does stabilize. And second, it's certainly true, I think, unless you are a University of Chicago economist, that the economy does, at least in the short run, respond to fiscal and monetary policy, and we are in the process of experiencing an enormous monetary policy stimulus, as Sinai pointed out, and a pretty big, although not overwhelming, fiscal policy stimulus. So I wouldn't be surprised if there wasn't some effect of that on alleviating or eventually slowing down the decline in output and employment that we've been seeing. On the other hand, I also wouldn't be surprised if one of two things happened. One is that it fizzled, and that this recovery that's scheduled for October or November somehow doesn't quite come about, that it really is more of a just coming to a level point, and a more level point. I wouldn't be surprised if that happened because there were shocks, unexpected shocks to the economy that are not included, for example, in Alan Sinai's careful picking apart of all of the cycles of the economy. I mean, that's a very good scientific method, but you have to understand that it's basically a method of extrapolating from the past. And so what he's talking about is what would happen on average if the U.S. economy behaved as if it does on average in the past. Well, typically the economy, as we know, doesn't just do what it does on average. It always does something else, and that's partly because unusual things happen. About a month ago, I think it was, Jeff Magic and I and Lance Taylor were talking about the question of just how far down the U.S. economy might go. And so I started to try to think about that a little bit in my own very simple-minded way. Now, we know that if you're a real business cycle theorist, or if I was out at the University of Chicago and heard people actually say this, it was sort of like visiting the Pleistocene and seeing a dinosaur actually eat another dinosaur. But anyway, that they really do believe that there is no impact of aggregate demand on output. They believe that output is just the result of exogenous shocks to total factor productivity, actually, and that's it. And everything else is just just appearance. But I actually was originally educated when Keynesian economics, the good old-fashioned Keynesian economics, I mean not neo-Keynesian economics or bastard Keynesian economics. Well, actually it was bastard Keynesian economics, but it was at least regular Keynesian economics was being taught. So I started to think about this going back to the kinds of tools that I've been taught in the 1960s at Yale University. And I'll just give you two examples of this, and maybe we can have a teeny bit of discussion or questions, or if people want to ask me afterwards. The first, so I was trying to say, well, where would the economy land? Now, I came out, roughly speaking, by one method of reasoning that the economy would probably stabilize with a peak to trough fall of real GDP of about 15 to 20%. Now, that is a lot bigger than what Alan Sinai was talking about, because he was talking about 4%. Okay, now, my first reasoning on this went something like this, and this leads to a real question, which I think is kind of unresolved about some things not adding up, including some of the stuff that Alex was pointing out about the typical patterns of productivity over business cycle downturns. I was saying, well, where do I think unemployment is likely to land? And it looks to me like unemployment might land in around the 10 to 12, 13% area. That's just by, more or less by extrapolation from the job loss and the rate of rise. And now that we're up to almost 9% in the last month, that doesn't look at all unreasonable that you're going to have momentum pushing it up to 12%. Okay, so then I said, well, maybe we started about 4% unemployment, something like that, 4.5. So that would mean something like an 8% decline in, an 8% increase in unemployment. And I went to the web and I looked up the thing that's called Okun's law, which when I was a student told you that a 3% change in real GDP corresponded to a 1% change in unemployment. Well, apparently there I'm out of date. It's now 2% change in real GDP gives you 1% change in unemployment. But if you do that, if you get an 8% increase in unemployment, you come out around 16% decline in real GDP. Now, Sinai is talking about a 4% decline in real GDP. So something is kind of missing here. Either if he's right, then there's going to be a huge increase in productivity over this business cycle, right? Unexampled increase in productivity over the business cycle, and I'm not too clear on how that's supposed to add up, actually, and maybe we'll hear more about that from Dick Freeman. Then the other thing I did, given that I'm a gadgeteer and addicted to computers, was that I actually put the good old-fashioned Keynesian model on Mathematica. Now this is all kind of sketchy, but here's the good old-fashioned Keynesian model. Y is equal to C, investment is investment, that's gross investment, plus G, that's government actual purchase of goods and services, X, exports, minus M, okay? And then C is equal to, these mantras, used to be all over the place, but they haven't actually been spoken in economics courses for many, many moons, I think. Anyway, C is supposed to be equal to a baseline C naught plus a marginal, this is called the marginal propensity to consume, that's little c, times Y minus T, that is income output after taxes and transfers. Then you get M is equal to M naught plus MC, and taxes are equal to little t times Y. And Mathematica allows you to do kind of neat things with this, which is particular that you can put these parameters into little sliders like this. And so this is, this you'll see along here are these parameters, C naught, the marginal propensity to consume, the level of investment, the level of exports, M naught, M, G, and T. And the absolute numbers here are keyed to potential output, which I took to be $14.25 trillion because that was what it was around the end of 2007, 2008. And this is really old-fashioned, no inflation adjustment. There's no supply side here whatsoever. We're not going to get in any trouble with a Phillips curve or anything like that because this is just, dollars. But you can see why this kind of reasoning is not so bad because we don't really think that over the next 18 or 24 months the inflation's going to be the huge big deal about this. Okay, so these numbers, for example, investment 0.1 tells you that I'm assuming that gross investment will be about 10% of potential GDP, that is $14.25 trillion, or M naught is about 8%, or C naught, let's say if it were, is about 30% of it, okay? So here's one scenario that I came up with, and you can look at these numbers. This sets C naught equal to 30%. It sets the marginal propensity to consume around 0.4. Investment about 10%. That's a little bit lower than it is right now, but not a whole lot. And in fact, our net investment, if you look at the capital consumption analysis, capital consumption allowances, is negative, as you would expect at a time like this in the business cycle. 8% for exports of potential GDP. So you multiply that by 14.25. I just thought it was easier to scale everything in terms of the potential GDP. M naught, M. G, I put at 22%, and the tax, this is the tax minus transfers rate at around 14%. So if you do that, you project an equilibrium income of about 88% of potential. That is, which would be like a 12%, a pretty moderate decline. C over Y would be about, then these are all in proportion to the actual projected income, about 69% and so forth. You can read off X over Y 0.09, M over Y about 0.15. So this still is showing a great big U.S. trade current account deficit, this particular type of projection. G over Y about 0.25, T over Y about 0.14, so you're getting a deficit of about 11% of GDP, which is, roughly speaking, in the ballpark of what people are talking about. Probably it's a little low. Well, the nice thing about this is that if you disagree with me, like Robbie Gutman looks like he's about to disagree with me. Well, suppose, for example, you really thought that the marginal propensity to consume was closer to 50%.
That's very conservative.
Well, remember that, okay, and maybe the baseline consumption is closer to 20%. But you'll notice that what happened when I pushed the slider around is that this projected column changed. Huh? This is the magic of Mathematica. Okay. Okay. So actually what you can do with this little gadget is if you want to, like you want to see what happens if you increase, let's say exports don't do so well, there's a negative shock in exports down to 6%, you can immediately see from this old-fashioned Keynesian point of view what the impact's going to be on income, consumption, and so forth. So, I don't know. I haven't gone through this with people who know better than I do what reasonable things are. On the other hand, just as a closing remark, this might look pretty crude and primitive, and it is crude and primitive, but let me tell you, a whole lot of sophisticated econometrics and all that is not going to help that much in this situation for the simple reason that we don't have that big a sample of the way that the U.S. economy behaves when it's under extreme stress of the kind that it's under right now. So I think actually this type of approach is going to be about as good as you can do. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So that phrase up top I'm actually serious about. Okay. But I don't have that much time to discuss it in light of the questions here, so let me go to some of those more directly. Back in 2003 in Challenge magazine, I set out why theoclassical economics creates a criminogenic environment that produces epidemics of control fraud. Control fraud is our term in criminology, and to back up 1 second, my primary appointment is in economics. I have a joint appointment in law, a doctorate in criminology, and I'm a former financial regulator that on the staff level did the re-regulation of the savings and loans industry from 84 to 87. So that's sort of where I'm coming from, those 4 hats. So control fraud is where the person who controls a seemingly legitimate organization uses it as a weapon to defraud. And in the financial sphere, which is what I've been asked to discuss, the weapon of choice is accounting fraud. So I was very well set up here because what I want to do is suggest that there's another discipline that looking at our work would be very useful, that it's well integrated into economic theory from our side, but ignored by economists from the more traditional side. And the difference could be set up really well by one of Alex's comments. You can't think systematically about what needs to be done if you focus on AIG. It's a small probability event. If you let that overwhelm you, you can't think systematically. And I would pull up Posner as well, who, as just as folks noted, wrote a book in which he says the mistakes were systemic, the product of the nature of the banking business in an environment shaped by low interest rates and deregulation rather than the antics of crooks and fools. And I don't know which direction to point towards NYU, but Larry White is resident there, and he famously, after being one of the 3 presidential appointees running the Federal Home Loan Bank Board, wrote a book saying that it would be a distraction to focus on fraud. Well, the savings and loan crisis eventually did lead to a systematic investigation by the National Commission, and it looked at all of the large failures and reported that the typical large failure fraud was invariably present. And they meant what we talk about in criminology as control fraud. So I would say the opposite. If you want to look systematically at this crisis, you must look at the fraudulent cases. And the fraudulent cases are not small, and you don't have to study them non-systematically. In the context of the savings and loan crisis, what led to the re-regulation of the industry was a systematic study in which we autopsied every failure that it came through. Right? And we looked for patterns, and we found patterns. And the patterns allowed us, to continue the medical public health metaphor, to triage. There was a distinctive pattern in how people were running frauds that an honest firm would not follow those practices. And that pattern existed because it optimized accounting fraud. And that was wonderful and very different than the current crisis because we were able, while institutions were still reporting record profits, because you don't engage in accounting fraud just to report so-so profits. You do it to report extraordinary profits. And indeed, that's one of the best parts, the easiest things to look for. Too good to be true, you would call it in any other sphere, right? And you would tell your kids not to believe it. In the financial sphere, we believe too good to be true all the time. And our most sophisticated analysts believe it. And those local folks that we were told about in the first talks, they believe it more than anybody. You know, those folks that shape global markets. Because that's why spreads are inherently irrational during any bubbles. So they got it completely wrong in all those circumstances. And we were able to close institutions until we ran out of money. As I said, that we're reporting record profits, but were in fact frauds. And when we ran out of money and we couldn't close them anymore, we passed a rule restricting growth. Because we recognized that, again, optimizing the accounting fraud meant that you had to grow extremely rapidly. So here's our rule. Notice how ridiculous it is. We restricted growth to 25% a year. Right? That's an insane growth level. But it's brilliant in another way. Because you're not going to hurt any honest firms with that restriction, but you're going to kill every Ponzi. And there were 300 savings and loans. All of them frauds, growing at an average rate of more than 50% a year when we started re-regulating the industry in 1983 and 1984. And so even though we ran out of money, and even though our successors were very positive towards these firms, every single one of them died, and they died within 2 years. Right? So, how do we study systematically in economics? We study systematically by doing econometric analysis. What does econometric analysis invariably produce during the expansion phase of the financial bubble? If you use as your outcome variable either profitability or share price, right? Because again, share price turns out to be manipulated easily by reported income. Then you're going to find that whatever practices best optimize accounting fraud will show up as being the most desirable practices. Right? And they will be lauded, praised by economists, as they were contemporaneously at every stage in all of these crises in every single country. I just got back from Iceland, presenting there. The good news is things can get much worse. The bad news is they will. right? Because right now, in terms of the assignment that I have, we are trying to recreate the status quo ante at the administration level, right? And so the animal spirits we are seeking to unleash are those of termites. The financial system is rotten dead wood. The last possible, no, we don't want to kill the banks. No one proposes killing the banks. Receivership doesn't kill a bank, it kills bankers. And it kills shareholders of insolvent banks. And they most assuredly should be killed, right? And in the sense that they should lose their money, it's risk capital. They're supposed to lose the money when the bank is insolvent, and the big banks are overwhelmingly insolvent. By the way, Iceland too did stress tests. Banks passed them with flying color in August of 2008, late August of 2008. By October 2008, if you remember your history, no more banks, no more Icelandic economy type of thing. So yet another area of great success, AIG as well, famously of course saying they couldn't envision a single scenario where they lose even a penny. Remember that quotation? And then, people forget this one, in February 2008, they did a quote-unquote severe stress test that showed that the worst conceivable loss was 900 million. That's an M, folks. So they were only off by about 200 times in terms of that, right? So econometric techniques in the context of fraud don't simply give you bad results, the results are far blanger. What does this mean? It means that we are not dealing with, notice the terminology. The administration has kept on Geithner, and so we have the continuation of things like legacy assets, right, which we're all supposed to use now, and banks are systemically significant. No, these are banks posing systemic risk. That's what they are, and they need to be called that. And I would call them ticking time bombs, except that many of them have already exploded. Right? And what do we have? We have, I'm not actually pointing your way, Alex is gone, telling me, that thank God we changed the accounting rules so that we could lie to people. Now, note this. He's telling us that markets are wonderful things, and that we can apparently fool markets if we lie to them consistently and keep insolvent banks open, because under what economic theory is that a good thing? I know a lot of economic theories, and they all say it's a really horrifically bad thing, and that if you keep on top of that in place the people in senior leadership positions who drove them into insolvency, that's the worst conceivable world. We talk about that in criminology, again, as optimizing a criminogenic environment, and that's our current plan. Keep deeply insolvent places open, allow them to lie about their asset values, and let the existing management stay in place. Now, let's do easy ones. Are they going to tell us the truth about their asset quality problems? No. Are they going to make the criminal referrals against themselves? I don't think so. Right? Are they going to be vibrant sources of strength in the future? Yeah, right. They will be, as Alex said, the phrase he used is resilient. Yes, the private sector. I'm sorry. Apologize to both of you. That it's resilient. But what does a resiliency consist of? It consists of getting massive subsidies from the federal government and bringing enough political pressure to game the accounting rules. That doesn't meet my concept of economic or financial resilience. And notice how he phrased it in terms of when he was talking about Bernanke getting skinned alive, right? Then Paulson was private sector. Remember that? Yeah. But when he got to the government plan, TARP 1, Paulson became public sector with his idiotic plan and a demonstration the public sector screws up. Paulson at all times was private sector, in my view. This is government Goldman, right? And if you want to continue government Goldman, you get the continued results of government Goldman. So that's one of the things that we need to change. I'll tell you, I'm the one who took the notes of the Keating 5 meeting, right? So I was one of 4 bureaucrats in which 5 U.S. senators came together to try to keep us from bringing an enforcement action against the worst control fraud in America, Lincoln Savings. To this day, I have no clue what the party affiliations are of the other 3 bureaucrats in that room. Right? We didn't give a damn. We didn't talk about it. We put people into receivership. And simultaneously, we got complaints that we were destroying Republicans vindictively and destroying Democrats vindictively. We figured we had to be doing something right, if that were true. You know, I blew the whistle on 5 U.S. senators and Speaker Wright for the 5 of the 6, bad math, are Democrats. I'm a Democrat. You know, it didn't matter. We have to get back to a very different world in terms of how we regulate institutions. So here are some of the reasons, very, very, very briefly, that all of this matters. How am I doing time-wise?
Yeah, you have about 6 minutes.
Oh, did way ahead of schedule. Okay. First, private market discipline not only does not work in these circumstances, it becomes perverse. And it becomes perverse because of aggression's dynamic. So, think about accounting fraud. And this very much picks up the speaker that we just had on what's the problem with financial compensation. The average CFO in America lasts 3 years. So having a short-term perspective is real rational. How long does the CFO operate if he or she doesn't follow the practices of accounting fraud? Because accounting fraud is a sure thing. We're used to thinking about finance entirely in terms of risk. It has next to nothing to do with risk as we conventionally teach it in finance. Accounting fraud, as long as the bubble expands, is an absolute sure thing. All you do is make the worst possible loans because people will pay more and because you can grow much more quickly. You grow extremely rapidly and you leverage like crazy. Those are the 3 optimization conditions. And if you do it, you are absolutely mathematically guaranteed to report not just profits, but record profits. The FBI, by the way, in terms of this quotation, began publicly testifying in September 2004 there was an epidemic of mortgage fraud. We'll be happy to give you the numbers in a detailed presentation. The FBI has understated the problem, and the numbers show it.
Who did testify?
I don't remember what was the House or the Senate, but I can get it for you. It wasn't secret and it was covered, right? Private market discipline in these circumstances will drive dishonest CFOs out because they won't last 3 years if they don't get their boss the big bonus. They'll be gone in 1 reporting quarter. Second, corporate governance. Elaborate, huge structure that we have. You can't govern a control fraud. It's the nature of the beast. It's in economics, the old joke about assuming the can opener. They're not going to put the board you want in. They're not going to pick the accounting firm you want. They'll pick their own, and they always end up getting clean opinions from top-tier audit firms. And they always end up getting superb ratings from rating agencies, and they always end up with massively inflated appraisals from top appraisers, right? So, you know, you can prate on all you want about corporate governance. It's a good thing. It helps honestly run places. It does squat with regard to the real problem that you're facing here. Similarly, tone at the top assumes that the CEO is honest, right? Charles Keating set a tone at the top, right? Frank Raines set a tone at the top. It's not the tone you want. It will produce the crisis. Agency cost. This implies that there's a cost, like a meter, and you put it in, and the agency problem is solved. You can't solve an agency problem when the CEO is the unfaithful agent, right? He or occasionally she will make sure that the other agents are equally unfaithful. Executive compensation. If you think about their own analysis on why you need to do executive compensation to align the interest, which is excessive power of the CEO, and that they will maximize self-interest, how will they use executive compensation under their own logic? To align their interest? No, that's not in their interest, to further misalign, so that they win regardless of what happens to the corporation. It allows the CEO to convert corporate assets to his personal benefit through seemingly normal, legitimate corporate mechanisms. I create record income, and in the modern era, that makes me extraordinarily rich in a way that is exceptionally difficult to prosecute. Right? And it's all blessed by top-tier auditors. It makes fraud a sure thing, I've explained that. The optimization process that I described, remember those three things, means that you don't get simply losses, you get off-the-chart losses with these major frauds because of the massive growth and the deliberate lending to bad credit. Such. Here's the last one I'll end on. Executive compensation, think of why they are so generous, not just to themselves, but to others. You can't send a memo in America to 9,000 employees saying, "Psst, we want to engage in accounting fraud."
Yeah.
But you can send the same message through your compensation system as soon as you make it clear that none of the profits need to be real. As soon as that was done at Enron, you don't have the smartest or the brightest people in the room. You have the least ethical people that remain in the room, and there's a self-selection process. Thanks.
I want to just point out that in every financial crisis that I know about, and I was not around in the Great Depression, but I was in Korea, Argentina, and Sweden as part of their crises, very different countries. The big losers end up being labor. It's in slightly different ways. In Korea, they have about a 3% unemployment rate now, so they've really made a tremendous recovery from the Asian flu crisis. But in fact, inequality's gone up, and they've had a decline in what they call regular or formal sector jobs. So almost all the growth of employment in Korea, the recovery has been in temporary low-wage jobs, and in particular, that means women really are in a bad state in that particular economy. So it's irregular work. Argentina, you may remember, was the poster child of Washington Consensus globalization. They had their crisis when the peso moved from 1-to-1 with the dollar to 1-to-3. Jump in poverty, jump in unemployment, inequality, came close to the end of the democratic state. There were, you may remember, there were 4 presidencies in a very brief period of time in the fall-winter period, and then finally they managed to stabilize and have somewhat of a recovery, but there's still a bit of a mess, and workers losing. The claim in Argentina was that the wealthy people were all warned about the change and took their money out of the banks early. We don't know if that is true. Every Argentinian believes it to be true. And when the IMF went in, they said one of the requirements of getting IMF aid to get them out of their problem was that they not examine this. They would not like Bill Blacks around in Argentina. So then we have Sweden. Sweden, I said poster child, not of Washington Consensus, but of welfare state. They also had a big housing and banking crisis, very similar to ours. And there was no rise in poverty because they have a really strong base for that. There was a modest rise of inequality that may have been good because they really had compressed things quite a bit in Sweden. But they have not, now, it's now like, they began, their recovery maybe was began from 92 to 96 or something like that. So it's a good 10 years, almost 15 years later, and they still have higher unemployment than when they went in, and they have a lot of long-term jobless. And they've been a really good recovery, I would phrase it this way. And so that tells us Then we have the U.S. situation of, which at the bottom here, I just said, this is a great test of our labor market as to how we're going to ultimately show this up in employment. I'm going to go through three problems, I think, in the recovery. The first is based on work I did with Bill Rutgers a while ago, and maybe he's going to talk more about it, I don't know. We didn't plan any of the things. This is basically that employment has become more and more of a lagging indicator in recoveries. And this occurred in the U.S. and in the other two economies that I know well, Sweden and Korea. But I think it's pretty widespread. This morning we had a visitor who didn't speak here, from Brazil, and he said the same thing happened in Brazil. A visitor, attendee of this conference, not a speaker. Okay, and that means we're going to need more of these social benefits that Teresa talked about, because the unemployment compensation is going to run out at the normal period we normally extend it. It's going to run out quickly, and I just can't see where the V, which was discussed earlier, is going to occur. Then I think there's another issue in our recovery, which the administration does focus on, but doesn't really quite know what to do with. And that is that it may very well be that we reached a level of inequality that we cannot have sustainable long-term growth. Some of that inequality is the big incentives in the Wall Street business. And I think we have to address that as part of the recovery plan, because otherwise we're going to get back into more problems. And then I show you this is my friend from Wall Street over there, and the hand is the dead hand of the Wall Street trying to grab control of our economy again. And I look around at the administration and elsewhere. I was shocked with the discussion of the bank stress things. There was almost no critical comments that I could see in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal. Maybe I missed some discussions, but sort of those were made-up stress tests made to give a political thing. So I said you need unions and other things to give some countervailing power in this process. That I don't view the trade union or labor or these other reforms as independent of getting the economy working in corporate governance, regulatory, et cetera. And there is Wall Street trying to do what it can. And then to me as a labor person, or a specialist in labor markets, I'm ashamed that I knew so little about financial markets. I trusted my friends over there to worry about that. And trusting them turns out not to have been a good idea. Either they were fooled, they were writing all these papers about the alignment of the of executive compensation, now, one of my friends, Dave Yermak at NYU, was always pointing out how the executives were finding ways to put the money in their own pockets. He had this wonderful paper on if you had a big fancy corporate jet, that meant your profits were going to go down because the executive was spending all of his resources and flying around in this jet from place to place, doing whatever he was doing, not doing his job. So I just think these are much too important to be left to the standard guys that we trust in this business, because whatever they do, it's a jobs issue. If you go back to the statement about Roosevelt, yeah, this is part of the process. Whoops. So there we go. So the issue thing is, what do we do if we have a second stimulus? I think there's one natural thing to do is to basically have some way of you support the public sector. You cannot let police and teachers and people, because the states are really under real budget decline, lose their jobs. In Massachusetts, I think it was yesterday, we've been having somewhat of an outbreak of youth murders. And it turns out the governor's plan, because of the budget crisis that he faces and not enough stimulus money to cover, was thinking of closing a program we have, which was meant to basically deal with these gangs so they kill less people. And I'm sure the governor, this is not what he wanted to do, but he had to cut some things out. Well, a little kid just got killed, and so it looks like this plan may not go through, but they'll find something else. They'll cut down some police or some public sector things. And that strikes me as the one thing we know about what they're doing is they are not building holes and filling them. They are doing work that in a normal economy, without this recession, we would all regard as, maybe they don't do it as efficiently as you'd like, blah, blah, but they would all be doing useful activities. So I was disappointed in the current stimulus package that didn't just say, we're not going to have any losses of public sector jobs. Obviously, the states can play games with you, so I said maybe you loan the money. I mean, I don't know exactly what rules you want to have for the federal government, but to keep the states from playing, they'll play games just the way Wall Street will in some sense. My state can do something, I'll finagle. Then I think if we do have a second stimulus, I would pour huge sums of money into scholarships. They have some plans to do this, but this has not been seen as part of the stimulus in some sense. And a high unemployment period, which I think we're going to have for a long period, is a time for schooling. That's basic economics, and everyone would agree with that. The opportunity cost is down. Our kids are not going to school and to university as much as the kids in, I think it's 12 or 15 other OECD countries. We've dropped down to the sort of lower tier of the pack of OECD countries. It seems something. Well, the R&D stimulus I mentioned with the question is $20 billion. It has a great danger that it will be a disaster. You pour $20 billion in 2 years, and then you drop it to zero. So imagine that you're a graduate student or somebody, you're going along and wonk. Well, I think they'll be more intelligent in this terrain than the current plan is. But obviously they've got to be pressed to make sure that it needn't be a stimulus that's really and truly ends. That would be a bad thing. And then I agree with the special speaker all about this green, the retrofitting. There's a whole set of stuff that clearly can be done. And there was a wonderful report by a whole bunch of U.S. agencies on zero energy buildings, which came out in November of this year. No one, as far as I know, read it because it came out at the absolutely wrong time. And it came out as pretty strong. There's a whole bunch of agencies, and they really did a wonderful job of what R&D you would need, what investments you would need. And it was an excellent kind of thing. So I think that there are areas for real serious major infrastructure investments that are good. Then I just put some other stuff in. Cut finance down to size. And I said it will destroy economies and jobs. That's just empirical fact. I don't want to go through all the rest. Oh, the green gallows for the crooked bankers. That's, someone said earlier, well, we don't want to destroy the banks, but we do want to destroy the bankers. And I think that will happen too. It happened in the Great Depression over a number of years. It took 6 or 7 years before guys started going to jail for what they did. I thought about inspector generals for companies. I don't know if that would work. We have those in the federal government. You have somebody whose job it is to look for all the malfeasance. And they have to have a separate career track. They can't be fired by the CEO. Their job it is to go into the CEO and say, hey, this accounting stuff looks really bad. And you can't fire me because my job title is set in such a way. And that's where our inspector generals work in the government. Then I want to try to end with this. I do not see a glimmer of slowdown in the growth of joblessness. And so I'll give you the numbers, the unemployment rate numbers. Those are pretty serious numbers. So I don't know, we'll see what happens in May. I have been assuming that we would hit 10% sometime in the early fall. Maybe we're going to hit that earlier in this period. But then I thought, I don't really know any more than anybody else knows in this sense. I'm extrapolating the way Duncan was in some sense and looking at stuff. So I thought, well, there is somebody smarter than me about this. It's the prediction market. So are people betting their money on this? And we see the unemployment rate. This is for a share you can buy in the prediction market, that as of December 2009, it's going to be greater than 10%. That share price, you see it going up and up. And what you look for here, which is interesting, is the stimulus package is announced. Stimulus, it's coming. You do not see any drop in this. You see, well, maybe it's stabilizing, perhaps. You might say that at some point. But you certainly don't see, and right now it's at the highest rate this will be. So the prediction market is saying there's a 70% chance we'll have unemployment rate December of the end of this year greater than 10%. Unfortunately, they don't seem to be selling shares on which we can bet, that it'll be 10% in 2010 or 2011. But I think the history is it's going to take a long time to recover. And I just, in this sense, I'm very, very sympathetic with Duncan's things. I don't see if we have 10% unemployment for a long period, how good our recovery can be. And then maybe it'll be the productivity thing that'll explain the difference. There'll be a big rise of productivity. There'll be firms raising sales but not putting on workers in some sense. Maybe that will be the catch, but that is will obviously be a very sick recovery to this. So I suppose that's the end of my talk.
Okay, thank you very much.
Again, I want to thank Jeff and Teresa for asking me to be a part of your conversation. To be I think, a friendlier audience than some of the CNBC folks I've been hanging out with the last few months. But to frame my comments, I want to give you three sort of pieces of where how I see the economy from some of my own work and from over the last few years, but also just currently where we are today. After November, after the election, I was asked to serve on the transition team for the Department of Labor. So that also, what I'm going to share with you in terms of some overall framing comments, has that in the back of my mind. And that one of the first phrases that we were really introduced to when we talked about transition was stopping the bleeding. It was all about stopping the bleeding, in that in terms of the recession and its continued deterioration, but also stopping the bleeding with regards to the financial sector. And it's already been said, to date we've lost over almost 6 million jobs since the start of the recession. And Richard just showed you unemployment has risen. Probably next month it will go to around 9%. Another important piece here is that the public is educated to talk about the unemployment rate, but something that Richard and we've always looked at in our work is the share of the civilian population that's got a job. Right? And if you do that, and you look back across time, you end up seeing that going into this recession, we actually were in a much more vulnerable state. The share of people working was just as high as it was at the beginning of the recovery. So the 2001 to the 2007 period, yes, you had economic growth, macroeconomic growth, GDP was growing, but from the standpoint of it really not even just creating shared prosperity, it was not pulling more Americans into the labor market. So that's the second piece. A good piece of information, is that there are folks who want to compare this to the Great Depression, and maybe that's aspects of the financial sector, but still when you look at the labor market, we have not, lengthwise we have just now surpassed the length of the 1981-82 recession, but from a standpoint of joblessness, from the standpoint of the number of people in the labor market, it still has not reached surpassed that period. And for me, age-wise, that was my first economic epiphany of the economy and recessions and how the labor market doesn't work for many Americans. A second sort of framing point is some work that I did and wrote in a piece for the American Prospect, where I got turned on to the United Nations has this interesting concept they call human priorities expenditures. Familiar with those? Where as a catch-all, as a share of GDP, what share of your government expenditures, you can do federal level, state level, municipal, but what share are being utilized on education, on training, on income security, on parks, on community-based types of investments. And what I did was I went back to 1959 and did this at the federal level, and I did it more recently across states. But there's an interesting trend that you can see in the data in terms of the human priorities expenditures for the U.S. at the federal level, that from 1975 to 1995, as a share of GDP, the human priority expenditures grew from about 17.4% to 19.1%. So for about an average, or a 1.7 percentage point increase, so about a tenth of a point increase per year. But from the period from 1959, that's as far back as you can go, to 75, we actually saw a 7.8% increase for about a half a percentage point annual increase. And then most recently, or from 2001 to 2007, it's been basically stalled at about 20% of GDP. For those of you who know the income inequality literature, what have I just linked that to? I've linked that to, right, we had the Great Compression, growing inequality, and then from 1995 to 1999, you do see some growth in the human priorities expenditures for the U.S., and then from 2001, 2007, we see the stagnating in investment in human expenditures, and it links up nicely, or unfortunately nicely, to growing income inequality, stagnating wages. And so the third piece is, and this is, I think, related back to my experiences being in the room and working on the transition team, is that if we're going to ask whether Obama should go further, the administration should go further, pursue some kind of mid-course correction, a second stimulus package, I think we also have to still remind ourselves to be cognizant of the ground that we lost over the last 8 years. Because that is some of the public conversations I've been getting into recently. There's this desire by a variety of constituencies to really already start to pushing and say, the Obama administration, you own the economy now. And that the benchmark for things for improvement is being shifted from the last 8 years to January 20th. And so I think as we proceed, and I like this aggressive approach, but we also have to make sure that we're very clear that we always anchor our arguments in the context of the last 8 years and try not to let people shift us to the beginning of January. As if you do that, if we look at the past 8 years, just some summary points. One, again, it's been talked about, there's been an erosion in labor standards. Retirement and college savings have taken major hits. Also, the unemployment insurance system, from a financial side, a fiscal side, and then also from the side of providing benefits to individuals countercyclically, it became less effective. So again, the bottom line of all these 3 points, particularly the human priorities expenditures in terms of we were growing, and those expenditures was connected to improving living standards, to a slowdown, which is connected to stagnating incomes, growth in inequality, and then with the strong economy of the 1990s, modest uptick in human expenditures, and then more recently the 2001-2007 stagnation, where that again, the longer-term conversation about sort of where we are today and the problems that has created for American families, and then most recently the 16-month, 17-month recession we were in, that again, this administration, and I'm trying to be fully a shill for the administration, but I think we have to remind ourselves that we're only in just a little more than 100 days. I mean, it feels like it's been much longer, I assure you. But so to have some credit to them in terms of their efforts and what they've been doing. Let me move on from there and those sort of framing kind of comments, and think about the administration's response from a labor standpoint. Department of Labor, we know about the stimulus package, and they only got about $5 billion of the $787 billion. A large part of that is going to active types of labor market policies, particularly investing in workforce training programs. We're all familiar with the Green Jobs workforce initiatives. There is money in there for expanding the Youth Build program for young, less educated, unemployed individuals. And then you also have that's the training component on the active side, but we also have job readiness types of dollars being spent. And then you have the competitive grants for these high growth industries, which is that's about the Green Jobs workforce. And Richard made an interesting comment in terms of not seeing a potential link from the stimulus package. Well, my sense when I look at the proposed budget, there has been, they offer it as, this is our biggest down payment to restoring prosperity, and you do see a continuation of some of the items, the active labor market policies proposed in the stimulus package. Continued focus on training the green workforce, working on improving providing transitional jobs and career pathways for young people, an extension or expansion of youth build. Also, a very important focus on trying to address the reentry challenges that ex-offenders face when they return to their communities. And then now, given with individuals coming back from the Middle East or coming back from abroad who are veterans, that we have to make sure we're doing a good job of helping them reenter. But again, though, because of the backdrop of where this administration has come from, my sense is they really have had to, again, deal with stop the bleeding. So that's why you see the issues around focusing on unemployment insurance reform, which we all know these proposals for reform, trying to make it better, improve opportunities to receive benefits for contingent workers. These proposals have been out for decades, but again, crisis, you seize the opportunity. But also, you see an emphasis on, at the Labor Department, restoring labor standards and enforcement. My agency that I had to do the review on was the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and I'm a data guy, right? So I was very much believed in what the BLS senior officials were telling me in terms of the importance of we need to make sure we get a good budget, even if it's what we were getting last year, because we're at the point of having to cut some major surveys, but also even beginning to have to reduce the size of some of the CPS samples or some of the employer-based samples. The big problem there is we aren't going to be able to get the detailed information on certain communities or certain demographic groups. But when we got into our big conversations about what are we going to emphasize, right? The issues around, again, stopping the bleeding. So employment training, right? Received a great focus, but also it was posed to me, Bill, you got $1 that you need to spend on enforcement versus data. Where are you going to, and again, the backdrop of where we've been over the last 8 years, where are you going to spend those dollars? So that's just to give you a little bit of an example of the underlying trade-offs that were there, that we faced. So let me turn my comments to the issues around should we prepare, and this is great we're having this conversation about a second stimulus, but I interpret it as a second stimulus package. And if I look at the variety of indicators, whether it be compared to other OECD countries in terms of our expenditures on active labor market policy, we severely lag other OECD countries. And also, we've been trending down over time. Okay? Why is that a big problem? Well, in the short term, looking at the macro indicators, as have been talked about, and then going forward, I too agree that I'm very nervous or concerned that we may have another jobless recovery. Richard will be writing another paper. But more importantly, there's some set of longer term indicators, those set of labor market indicators that have some very disconcerting long term problems associated with them. One, long-term unemployment, that is the share of unemployed who are unemployed for more than 27 weeks, has been structurally rising over time. And now with the recession, about a quarter of the unemployed are long-term unemployed. Okay. I too also go beyond just the 13 million of Americans who are unemployed, searching for a job. I've been following the 9 million Americans who work part-time for economic reasons. So these are people who are living in communities where, again, it's slack aggregate demand at the local, regional level. If we look demographically, we see actually men during this recession have actually borne the brunt of the job losses, particularly because of the manufacturing and construction, but also conversely, women have been able to have lost, but because of their concentrations in education and health services, they have not done as badly. Typically, again, we're seeing the same old, that teenagers, particularly African-American teens and now Latino teens, having great difficulty. And then there's a geographic lens here. We were talking during some of the breaks about the car industry. Detroit or Michigan's unemployment rate is up to about 13% now. Detroit's doubled since the beginning of the recession, or since March of 2007. So those are all, whether it be demographic, whether it be geographic, whether it be the kind or the type of unemployment that people are experiencing, these are all, I think, pieces of evidence for me as to why I could see us having to come back and have some type of second stimulus package. What will that depend on? I think it comes down to three issues. One is, does the U.S. recovery, does it tend to be much slower than the OECD countries? Two, as I said, stimulus package number one doesn't generate the desired job creation. I think it's been said, people think it's too small. There are other unknown shocks. Most recently, there was concern about whether swine flu was going to have a major economic impact. And the other piece that's quietly talked about, I think more in D.C., less so outside the Beltway, and that is what I talk with my intro public policy students, that's the technical administrative feasibility. I've talked to a number of colleagues at the department, whether we have a labor secretary who's been installed or been confirmed, but there's a series of assistant secretaries and deputy secretaries that you can get into this, well, why are they not being confirmed? But the bottom line is that they're not there. They're not there to provide the political leadership in terms of how we're going to administer these dollars. And then also, if you look at the employment in many of these agencies that are receiving dollars, I'll take the one I know, the Department of Labor, again, recasting over the last 8 years, there have been a dramatic reduction in staff. So at one level, we could be creating a self-fulfilling prophecy of, well, seriously, hey, we gave out close to $800 billion to try to jumpstart the economy, or at least cushion the blow of the economy, but because of these constraints within being able to allocate and get the dollars out quickly, it'll just confirm some people's view, well, see, the government can't do or do a good job, as good a job with your money as you can yourself. So just a caution and concern. And then the third point, I think, is that we'll usher in a conversation, a potential second stimulus package will be this issue around another jobless recovery. And so when that conversation comes, I could continue to see and agree with Richard that you'll see, I think, more dollars for education and training, and then also the job search assistance, because there are job openings, but it just becomes much, much harder for individuals to find those jobs, for those matches to occur with employers. Yep. And then the third is that my reading of looking at the budget is this budget was very light on direct job creation. It was very light on direct job creation. And my sense is, again, if what I'm laying out here does come to fruition, that the specter for having more dollars for direct job creation, not just disadvantaged groups, but more broadly, that'll take on greater traction. When will this occur? We have to probably now take our economics hats off and think about the politics. You have midterm elections. Then you have Obama starting to think about a second term. So one could begin to think strategically where one would like to begin to insert yourself into a conversation. So those are just some quick thoughts for you to begin along with everybody else's to stimulate conversation. But again, Jeff, Teresa, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Looks like we have 15 minutes for questions. I'd like to take the prerogative to ask the first one to both to Dick and to Bill. What is meant by active labor market policies in Europe is something much more direct about job creation. Active labor market policies are usually something about creating incentives for companies not to let their employees go completely. Not to go from 40 hours a week to zero, but to somehow keep them, to hoard labor, to keep that unemployment rate from actually falling because somebody has lost their job and they're just waiting for a recovery. That's just more direct, much more efficient. You save human capital, you save depression, you save suicides, you save all the human loss and output loss of full unemployment. So I found a real disconnect, Bill, between your concerns about what this unemployment number looks like. Remember last month, 72,000 jobs that made that 40,000 job loss not look so bad came from the government. So we need 160,000 jobs per month. We lost 530,000 jobs, but 72,000 of those jobs were government jobs. So Dick and Bill, if you had another second bite at the apple, and we had another stimulus program, and we wanted job creation numbers there, because if you train people, like in this stimulus package, for jobs that aren't there, you're getting some counter-cyclical activity, but you're not getting job creation. How many jobs has to come from the state governments or the federal governments to actually make a dent in these dim numbers? Do you have a back of the envelope idea? Another 300,000 jobs?
I haven't done that calculation.
Yeah, I've not done the calculation.
I rest my point. Don't we all have to make that calculation before we even think about what that second stimulus looks like? And if Leo was here, I think he'd make that point too. Okay, I'll open it up to the audience now. Thank you. Yeah, Duncan.
I was just going to make a remark on the second stimulus idea and fiscal policy in general. It also connects up to the New Deal. It's often said that the recovery at the time of the rearmament for the Second World War in 1940 shows that fiscal policy in principle could have solved the problem of unemployment and stagnation in the 30s. It just wasn't big enough until you had the remilitarization. But as I've thought about that, and I used to think that, but I think that there's a couple of things we ought to keep in mind about that. One was that the rearmament spending was inherently open-ended. Okay, it was not a 2-year stimulus or a 3-year stimulus. It was saying the federal government was going to spend as much money as was necessary to solve this worldwide military political crisis, which was essentially open-ended, and nobody knew how long that was going to be. And second, it was accompanied by a tremendous structural transformation of the U.S. economy, because over the rearmament period, almost 50% of the U.S. economy became effectively nationalized, or if you dare use the word socialized, through the military, basically through armaments and the military apparatus. So I would be a little wary of using that as evidence that just deficit spending of the kind that the stimulus represented is going to make a huge dent if we hit a period of long-term stagnation.
Alex Field. Do you want to respond to that, Alex? Could you think about that, Simon?
Well, I guess to counter that, there was actually, from a small base, there was an increase in government spending over what Hoover had been done, after Roosevelt came in. Rightly or wrongly, whether that was the factor, we had an extraordinarily strong recovery from 33 to 37. So I think there's some evidence that if you multiplied the Hoover dams and the street and highway construction and the TVA and whatever, I mean, there were structural problems in housing and in residential construction. Other work I've gone into what those are, and so absent kind of what you might have expected a normal recovery there, I do think you needed stronger, federal infrastructure spending in order to close that potential output gap. What Duncan says about the Second World War is correct. I've looked at it actually from the productivity side, and I actually think it was quite negative from the productivity side, rather than, as many people argue, laying the foundation for the post-war prosperity. Foundation was there in 41. It was a wrenching change. In 2 years, you had an extraordinary expansion of five sectors of the economy, and then an equally rapid decompression of steel, chemicals, machinery, and so on.
Yeah, I mean, when we want to talk about midterm, I mean, I think it's a misnomer to call it, because we're nowhere near the middle even, right? I think we need to really think of this as very, very long term. And in the first phase of the Obama administration, I mean, they really needed to stop the bleeding in the sense that they had to do something immediately. He wanted to have a program by the time, on the 20th of February, so he gave it to the House and the Senate, and then became completely politicized in that process. So he never got his priorities, the long-term priorities. And so he's in an unfinished business here, because he's stuck with a 2-year program, facing a crisis that will take longer than 2 years. And I've seen him sort of, especially in the speech that he gave at Georgetown, the beginnings of a much longer-term strategy, where he wants to build new growth foundations, and they're obviously reindustrialization-based, human capital investment-based, and they need to be tied to tax reform, social security reform, and Medicaid reform, just to keep the fiscal path in some kind of control, right? So I think what we really need to talk about in subsequent meetings is a much broader, longer-term vision, rather than this sort of cyclical fiscal policy response framework that we have, because we have a structural crisis and it gives us the opportunity to transform structurally our capitalist system. I think this is not a cyclical crisis. And therefore I think we need to have also a different conceptual framework of the role of government.
And if I could just interject, I mean, some of this I've signed an affidavit of document that I can't divulge certain things, but from our work, I mean, we did have, I mean, Stop the Bleeding at that time was really about the 8 years, sort of taking some of the turf back on the 8 years, and less so on the recession, and that got overlaid. But there was other, at least labor policy, labor ideas, there was this additional set of ideas that were long-term, long-term agenda.
Here, and then back there, and then Jeff. Right there, yes.
Okay. Yeah, I was thinking, particularly with William Black's presentation, I mean, the fraud in the S&L markets, I mean, there was no accident, too, that in the 1980s was a major, covert operations were a major part of U.S. foreign and military policy. I'm largely thinking of using Israel and Saudi Arabia to launder weapons to Iran, funneling the money back to fight many wars in Central and South America, and then in order to also fund that, we had a major spike in crack cocaine popped up, and huge profits are being made and laundered through S&L type institutions. So there's a link between kind of a foreign and military dominance strategy and flows into certain parts of the financial system, particularly the mortgage system and the S&L crisis. I mean, there's some work on this by some people too. I just wondered if you would comment on that.
There is some work by a particular journalist who wrote a book about that. Overwhelmingly, the savings and loan story is a story of commercial real estate. Yeah. If you want to look at where the losses are. And it eerily foretells the current crisis in terms of what happens when you deregulate and desupervise at the same time. And then accounting fraud makes people spectacularly profitable, allegedly, for a short time.
Yeah, who needs cocaine if you have commercial real estate?
He produced a financial real estate bubble in the Southwest in the savings and loan crisis. With the banking system much bigger, you were able to produce worldwide bubbles.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
Harking back to the discussion earlier this morning about the political difficulties of trying to redress the balance in terms of wages and the wage freeze and the inequality, it seems to me that's the major issue. It's the elephant in the room. There's got to be a strong enough political force to force Congress to pass the Employee Free Choice Act, and that's just like a pale halfway mark. I mean, we need somehow the political force to get away from the fact that the Democratic Party is a partially owned subsidiary of the financial sector and return to the New Deal coalition. It's not easy, but without that, nothing else happens. If wages don't go up, nothing else happens.
I just want to open, this is a university, I want to open it up in the last couple of minutes, and then I'll get to Jeff, to the students who might be in the room, who would like to make a comment or to pose a question. Yes?
Can anybody speak to how this all looks locally in New York City, and what the effects might be on realities, in terms of realities on the ground for New York City?
I can say something very, very briefly, and it has to do with the fact that, during the 20s and during the last 25 years or so, the finance sector grew tremendously. It grew in employment, it grew in remuneration, and it grew in the share of corporate profits. I mean, I looked at the numbers recently between 2001 and 2004. Finance sector was booking 35 to 40% of domestic corporate profits. That's not going to continue. And so I think there's going to have to be a permanent adjustment downward in the size of the finance sector to what it was in the 60s and 70s. And that's going to be, that's going to propose a wrenching change with respect to the New York economy. That's my
But
insight.
25% of the New York economy, 25% of income to households comes from that financial sector, so that's great, that's a good
But all the
perspective.
stimulus is to support Wall Street.
Yeah, so
Oh, there you go.
yeah, it has been. Any other students, the SCEPA students? Yes, and thanks for your help with that.
No, I was wondering if you believe that the U.S. economy is going to become more European in the way that the European economies in the last 15 years have had economic growth, but at the same time have had high unemployment rates. So the U.S. economy is going to have a long-run high unemployment rate combined with a growth rate, a positive growth rate.
Yeah.
That is one possible outcome, but we don't have the social insurance base to allow that to happen. And we also have one other, our unemployment statistics are probably understate what's happened, because we've seen the immigration slow down. So our unemployment in some sense is being exported to the countries where people normally would come here for better things. And what I think the alternative to the European style is much more developing country style, where you have an informal sector out there of people doing things, and that's been growing in the U.S. So we would have to put a lot more building up of these active labor and passive labor market programs.
Yeah.
And that depends on the political pressure there will be for them. In some sense, that's clearly at best, a second best, because you would rather have rapid growth that creates jobs rather than having this long-term unemployment. But Bill said the long-term things are going up.
It's just over the last 2 decades, this has trended up. And there's a cyclical variation, but again, we're at 25% now. We basically hit the rate in 1982 recession.
Go back to Bernanke's original Great Moderation speech as well, if you want to be scared, because he talks all about how we've accepted or tried for a much too high an employment rate, and we need
That's
to
right.
accept higher unemployment going forward.
Yeah. Jeff, you want to
I wanted to ask Bill quickly, but because we didn't get the solutions for the financial crisis, so in a
Yeah.
nutshell, Bill, what should we do?
Well, A, you should put insolvent banks into receivership. B,
Do
you
you
should
have a number on that, though? or
How many
estimate?
banks would that be?
You have to look.
300 banks?
And what they're doing now is not looking.
So what do you think it is? And how many?
No, but the FDIC is a premium thing.
Yeah, that number is meaningless. The meaningful number is the estimate of what the total losses are.
Okay.
So if you back out from that $2.8 to $2.4 billion figure, they've recognized to date maybe 500 billion of it. So that's how much is out there unrecognized. That's your best crude estimate. You have to really pay that price to be able to resolve things. Or you go with the Japanese solution of hiding the losses, and they don't have a lost decade at this point. They have 2 lost decades and every prospect of a next lost decade and such. You need to actually get rid of a lot of the derivatives, right? A lot of the CDS is, in fact, the overwhelming bulk of CDS is not used for any of the purposes that they were sold on the basis. They're used to reduce capital requirements, and they're used for naked shorting, both of which probably don't make a whole lot of sense, and they certainly pose excessive risk. So you need much more significant restrictions there. You obviously need to regulate mortgage banking instead of using preemption to make sure that nobody gets to regulate it in this sphere. The EU has we haven't talked about Europe very much at all. Germany is going to be taking the whole continent down, I think, and East Germany is their East Germany is their subprime crisis. I'm sorry, Eastern Europe is their subprime crisis.
Also, the bad bank proposal means 20 years long. Disaster.
Yeah, Basel needs to be, Basel II is almost entirely bad. So we need to recapture the entire Basel network. It isn't just the U.S. appointees. Our damn grad students are everywhere. They're horrific on those issues.
All right, well, there's a jobs program, receivers and regulators. Any other comments from students? Yes, Laura, yes. Very good.
So I've been working on this Minsky old paper that sets up the balance of payments for the U.S. and for the rest of the world. I will make a question more the world economy against the New York City. So the U.S. trade or current account deficit. Minsky is discussing the trade-offs between the different items of the U.S. balance of payments. So the current account deficit would be compensated by interest payments or other items that would bring money to the U.S. And this, of course, has impacts on the employment in the U.S. in these trade-offs because the current account deficit would, take out employment, employment from the U.S. So my question is whether there is a prospective change in this pattern, meaning to bring employment back to the U.S. economy, maybe reduce this current deficit account and the impacts of this in the rest of the world.
So your question is, should we focus more on keeping jobs here?
Yeah, is that I don't know, I think it's...
Is that part of the conversation? Is it what are people thinking about?
Is it what the U.S. economy is serving?
Bill, what about this idea of moving away from free trade and actually seeing this is... I know we're talking about this. There's big subsidies to the car companies, but the U.S. government is allowing the car companies to create jobs in China and to import cars here with loans. But
I think you have to have first off, we've got to strengthen the safety nets to help individuals and communities that are going to get displaced, but then also provide the incentives for job creation and growth.
The answer would be no. Well, I promised that we would end at 1. It's 1:07. And I want to thank you for coming to this conversation. If you have any comments on this conversation, let Jeff or I know, and we'll have more of them if those comments are positive. Thank you.